Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this afternoon at Google's CSG, Central St. Giles. I thought it was Customer Service Group, something like that. Central St. Giles. I'm going to be speaking today about counting the cost of the not-so-lean enterprise. It's a bit of a mouthful. Sorry, there's just a slide about myself. I'm Graham Zabel. I head up our DevOps practice within Devo Team UK. But I prefer this title, Storage is Cheap. How many people have heard this expression, storage is cheap? And we've just had a nice talk on storage and how we store lots and lots of data in data marts and data warehouses. So we all think storage is cheap, and because it's cheap, we don't think about it, really. But I will argue today that we should be thinking about it. Data centers are currently responsible for about 3.6% of our global carbon emissions. That number is going to grow as we build more and more data centers and as other sectors within our economy decarbonize. So lots of other sectors are working very hard at decarbonizing, as is the IT sector. But because data centers are growing so quickly, we are going to be producing more and more of the world's carbon in the future. So this is, it's an ethical issue. The ecological impacts of computation in the cloud. It's an environmental issue. We look at this headline at the bottom. Air travel is currently responsible for 2% of global emissions, so almost half of that of data centers, and yet it's very much in the spotlight now about reducing air travel, et cetera. So we can be sure that emissions associated with storage are going to become an increasingly hot topic in the future. This is a headline from a couple of months ago. The Security and Exchange Commission in America wants all public companies to be reporting on their carbon emissions. This is the direction of travel globally. It's not only in America, it's not only public companies. We are all increasingly going to have to report on our carbon emissions. So making data storage efficient, it's not a nice to have. It's really essential if we want to play our part in getting to net zero in the future. This, by the way, this reporting is not only, you may have heard of Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are the hardest ones to track and the ones where most of our carbon is being emitted. So more and more companies have up till now been very good at reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but now we're going to be having to report on Scope 3 as well. And the companies that do best in reducing their carbon emissions are the ones that are going to be most successful in the future. More and more of our consumers are going to be asking us, how much carbon do we produce in when we go about our business? So they're going to win. They're going to win reputationally because the public cares. They're going to win also in terms of saving money and being more efficient. Okay, so I've been working in IT for over 30 years, I'll have to admit. And one of the things that's disturbed me most in my time in IT is how much waste there is in IT. And this problem doesn't seem to be getting better as we get more and more complex, as organizations get larger with increased scale. This issue of waste is getting worse. Now I'm going to speak today. I'm going a little bit off piece, by the way. I'm not going to talk about GCP necessarily. I know we're in the Google building at the moment, but really I'm going to talk generally about DevOps and carbon. And this issue goes beyond any one cloud provider. It's also an on-prem issue, and specifically around DevOps. Our DevOps pipelines are really underpin everything we do in our IT organizations. It's a platform that it affects everyone. You could take something like a Kubernetes platform. Kubernetes affects people that are using containers. You can talk about data platforms where we've just discussed. But DevOps really is pervasive across everything we do. So poorly maintained DevOps engines they're wasteful, they're costly, they are polluting. If they don't perform well, it's a very poor developer experience. So, and in fact, if our DevOps tools are out of date, if they're not running well, we'd get staff attrition. People leave. They leave to go to companies that do this better. So it's about keeping and attracting our staff. And ironically, despite the fact that these DevOps engines are important across all our IT organization, they're underfunded and understaffed, typically in large organizations. So, and one other thing. So I'm going to use this image of a physical data warehouse and compare it to what we do in the DevOps world in terms of storing things in virtual warehouses. So what do we store in these virtual warehouses for DevOps? We store things like wiki pages, Jira projects, code repositories, CI/CD pipelines, artifacts, telemetry. All this is really kind of pure DevOps stuff that comes out of our DevOps tool chains, but also more broadly, cloud resources, applications themselves, processes, automated workflow management tooling, et cetera, et cetera. So the commonality with all of these virtual warehouses that store our virtual DevOps stuff is it's very easy to get stuff into these warehouses. And it's very, very hard, once it's in these warehouses, to get it out. Almost impossible, in fact. So why is it impossible? A lot of companies, specifically financial services companies, have very strict data retention policies. So once data is in a warehouse, it has to stay there for at least 7 years. It cannot be removed. To try and get it removed is layers and layers of bureaucracy if you want to delete something in a production system. After 2, 3, 4 years, we start to lose track of what's important in these stores. So it's often the people that create these Jira projects or these code repositories, then they, after 4 years, they've left the company. Their name is still attached to this stuff. No one knows what to do with it. Is it important? Is it in use? We don't know. So if in doubt, we leave it there. There's a fear factor. If we don't know, best not to touch it. And then really importantly is a lot of this data is missing the tags and labels that can tell us what this data is. And I'm going to get back to that because that's a very important topic. Right, so as a consequence, because it's easy to get stuff in and hard to put it out, these stores get bigger and bigger and bigger until they look like the virtual equivalent of this. So this is a mess. So if you take this concept of a warehouse, if you think about an IKEA warehouse, and you go shopping to IKEA and you look through all their showrooms, and then you go downstairs to the floor below, and you have these big warehouses with aisles and aisles of cardboard boxes. Can you imagine if half of those boxes didn't have labels on them? You wouldn't have a viable business. Walking around IKEA trying to find stuff and there's no labels on it. And yet we do exactly that in the virtual world. We store stuff in these repositories, in Jira systems, in telemetry systems, and we don't label it. So we don't actually even know what it is. Or sometimes we'll have, you can see some pictures on here, someone will scribble some writing on a box and that means something to them and to no one else. And we do exactly that in our code repositories. We'll store some code and we'll say, my cool project. No one knows if that project is in production. If it's not in production, can we delete it? We don't know. So, so much of what we're storing really has no function. It just sits there forever and ever. It sits on the top shelf. No one ever looks at it. And often these DevOps tools, the task of managing these tools, particularly legacy tools, we hand off to potentially a lonely contractor. So you've got one person who's in charge of this legacy Git repository. There is no way that they have time to go through and look at the top shelves and start cleaning this stuff up. They're just dealing with the day-to-day noise of running these systems. Or sometimes even worse, we'll outsource it to a third party, and that third party will have no incentive or no interest to tidy this stuff up. They're just charged to manage it and keep it going. Now, the biggest difference between this warehouse and a virtual warehouse where we're storing all kinds of crap is in the virtual warehouse, it's using electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So it's consuming lots and lots of power, which is contributing to this 3.6% of our global carbon emissions. So what do we do when we what do we do when we have a situation like this? And I was going to mention an anecdote with one of our clients we're working with. They have a Git repository. It's now probably 10 years old. It's a GitLab repository. It's probably 5 major versions out of date. One contractor is supporting it. We tried to upgrade it to the latest version of GitLab. So we tried to do this in a pre-production environment. It took 1 week to upgrade the system because it was so many versions out of date, because there was so much stuff in there. So essentially they said, can you imagine sending an email to your developer community and saying, really sorry guys, but we're going to take down our Git system for a week. You can't check any code. No one is ever going to do that. It's too embarrassing. You'd probably lose your job. So what do? We just say, oh, well, let's buy a new instance. And so we end up and we go and buy a new instance. And we end up with a new repository. And then we have a massive migration project to put the mess into the new warehouse. And believe it or not, this is happening right now with this particular client. They've got all this stuff, so they're now going to migrate the 50,000 projects into their brand new nice warehouse because they don't know what all these things do. So if in doubt, just migrate it. They'll write really nice automated migration scripts, and they'll migrate all the mess into the new system. So if you take some of these tools, we've got Confluence spaces where up to 80% of the data is out of date. We've got Jira projects or Jira systems with lots and lots of dead projects or empty projects, or people spin up a Jira project and they run it for 2 months and it gets canned, and then that Jira project stays there forever and ever. Or we've got some from 5-6 years ago where the owners are long gone, no one knows what to do with it, so they leave it there. We've got thousands of custom fields which make this Jira system itself slower, more cumbersome, providing a poorer experience. These systems then become hard to maintain, hard to upgrade. You get poor developer experience, as I mentioned. So what do we do? Well, let's get a new Jira instance. Code repositories like GitLab, GitHub, Perforce previously. As I mentioned, the one particular instance that I've been working on recently has 50,000 repositories in it. There's Hello World projects or test projects from 5 years ago. You'll get proof of concept projects. People they create a proof of concept, they store it, they forget about it, they leave the company, and it just sits there for at least 7 years, probably longer, all adding up to this poor developer experience and poor tooling. A colleague that I talked to recently worked with a Midlands utility, lifting and shifting 200 applications into the cloud. As they went through this exercise, they realized that 80 of those 200 applications were not even used, were not needed. They've been superseded, they were obsolete. So 40% of their running applications were essentially not used, 40%. I should have changed that logo to AWS, but to GCP, but this was an AWS issue where we've recently been working with another client. They had a whole development system that customers could use on AWS to create prototypes and create test projects. They came to us because their costs were exploding, because it was insecure, and we spent 6 months, 2 people, 6 months on this, and we cut their cloud bills by 80% just by turning off stuff that was no longer needed, no longer used. We've worked with another client. They have over 1,000 container platforms because there's no governance around how you create a container platform, so every team just spins up their own, and all of a sudden you've got 1,000 different container platforms. This is another example I want to talk about in terms of artifact repositories where we store our binary artifacts, our code libraries. These are 2 different banks that I've been involved with and with their artifact repositories. The one on the left is twice as big in a bank in terms of developer community applications as the one on the right. And yet their artifact repository is 1/10 the size. So I worked on this artifact repository. And it was already bloated, and we did a lot of work reorganizing it, putting controls and guardrails around how we use this. We got it down to 7 terabytes, and given more time, we could probably have shrunk that in half again, or certainly by a couple more terabytes. We knew there was still a lot of junk in there that hadn't been cleaned up. Now you take the instance on the right, there's no governance in that instance. People just dump stuff in there and it never gets cleaned up. So you've got, for example, backups of entire websites on a daily basis being backed up into this repository for years and years, and then all of a sudden they stop. So let's say there's a major website, they're backing it up every day, and in 2021 they stop backing it up. And no one knows why, but the backups have stopped. So do we still need to keep those backups? Do we just keep them there forever? Do we need to keep every day's backups, or can we cut them down to 1 a month? We don't know, so they're all still there. We've got continuous build servers, Jenkins servers, or GitLab build servers, pumping out artifacts. So because we have this lovely continuous build and continuous deploy systems, we have these continually deploying artifacts into these repositories, sometimes every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes. And there's no governance to clean this stuff up. So this just grows and grows and grows until it's 70 terabytes in size. And then it becomes almost unupgradable because it's so big and so cumbersome. So we're not talking about sort of 5-10% difference in the way you can improve your storage. We're talking about a magnitude of difference, or 90% better, more efficient ways of storing data. So what do we do? As I've said, what do we do? We typically just buy a new instance and then migrate all this stuff over. But really, what should we do is make it harder for that data to get into our systems. When I say make it harder, so I don't mean make it harder to create a Jira project or make it harder to create a code repository. This stuff is typically already too hard. So if you take creating a Jira project, for example, it's about a 5-minute exercise if you're a Jira admin to create a Jira project. But if you're in most large enterprises, that 5-minute exercise probably takes 2 days or sometimes a week to get a Jira project, because you don't have admin rights, so you've got to fill out forms and create requests that go to a central team, and they do it for you. And this 5-minute exercise takes an elapsed time of 2 days or so. So I'm not suggesting make it harder to create this stuff. In fact, we should make it easier to create Jira projects and code repositories and Confluence spaces, etc., but make it harder for this stuff to stick. So make it harder for it to persist. And how do we do that? Well, we can have ring-fence sandboxes. We can say, if you're creating proof of concepts or Hello World projects, great. Put them in the sandbox, knowing that we're going to delete all this stuff within 6 months. So you can start your sandbox today. You don't have to fill out any forms. Start today, but put it in the sandbox. And if you want to move it to the next stage, then you can start filling out the forms for a longer-term lifespan. But you can create the stuff today. We'll clean it up for you. Tagging stuff. Arguably, if your code repository or your Jira project or your artifacts do not have tags, they should be ripe for deletion. If something doesn't have a tag, you should delete it. Everything you store in these systems should be tagged either with by an application name or a product code or a team. Certainly not an individual. Individuals come and go. There's no point tagging stuff with an individual's name, because by the time you have to deal with it, they've probably left. So you should be tagging it by a product code or an application code, and then you can get really good information around who's using all of our storage. If half the stuff in your code repository is tagged with equities, say if you're in a bank, then you can go to the equities department and say, you should be paying for half of this storage because it's all your stuff. So by tagging things, it makes it much easier to manage what's in there and what you can do about it. And then I mentioned the guardrails as well. Put guardrails in. If a Jira project hasn't been touched for a year, send the team an email, send a second email, send a third email reminder. If no one does anything about it, then you can archive it or delete it. So make it harder for data to stick and make it easier to delete stuff, which goes hand in hand. So if things aren't tagged, delete them. If things haven't been touched for a year or 2 years and you cannot delete them, put them in a deep archive. Have automated cleanup policies. So when we talk about being greener and we talk about being more efficient and reducing our carbon emissions and getting to net zero, there's a lot of talk about we can all the cloud vendors will give you great tools to downgrade your compute instances if they're not utilized properly, or move your storage to lower tiered storage classes. You can save 5% here or save 10% here by using your infrastructure more efficiently. I would say a lot of that is just dancing around the edges. We've shown examples here where we're talking about 90% savings or 40% savings by doing a better job of understanding what we're storing. So these are essentially easier problems to solve and will give us a much, much bigger bang for our buck in terms of saving costs and reducing emissions. So we want to get to a place where we have storage like this, no matter how big or how small. Everything is labeled properly. Everything you can see here has a barcode in it. We should be able to scan the stuff and know exactly what it is, know exactly who owns it, know exactly how long it's been there, and does it need to stay there, or can we get rid of it? So storage is cheap. Smarter storage, which in my book means less storage, is cheaper, more productive, provides a better user experience, and most importantly, is less polluting. And that's my talk. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I'm curious, is there much on data dupe that you find, so hashing and finding identicals in data stores? Because from experience, that tends to be a really big piece of the storage. And I'm wondering if there's an automated way that you've got to do.
Yeah. It's a good point. I think that would be part of our automation task, is you can automate a lot of that stuff as well. I don't mention that specifically, or I haven't mentioned that specifically in this talk, but very much so. It's another way of using data badly. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. You started off the presentation with mentioning some of the carbon footprint numbers and percentages. Now, let's imagine that we all become very aware and responsible storage citizens. How much of that carbon footprint number can shrink by becoming responsible?
That's a very good question too, Dennis, and I certainly don't have the answer to that. And I mean, you could just talk about cat photos probably, and there's probably more storage with cat photos than a lot of this DevOps stuff. So how big those numbers are, I don't know, but I think what I do know is that there are vast amounts of waste. And we need to be able to tackle that waste in an automated, efficient manner. And we can do our bit to help solve this problem. And also to provide much better developer experience, because I see so many developers struggling with their tools. Jira, sorry, I'm going a little bit off piece with this answer, but I've talked to some Jira administrators with one of our clients too, where everyone is complaining that Jira is too slow. And if developers, if it takes 1 second to load a page, you can kind of live with it. It takes a second. It should take a tenth of a second. But if you add up that 1 second times every time you load a page, times every developer and everyone that uses Jira in your company, you can come up with very significant numbers. So I think, how much we can save, I don't really know, but I do know that doing our bit will give you lots of other benefits as well.
So I have a question. You mentioned migrating old repositories to an instance in the cloud. How far would that go to tidying up the data?
From moving on-prem to cloud?
Yeah. So...
Or just the migration itself?
Yeah.
some companies, the one example I use where they're lifting and shifting applications, as they do that, they kind of, you've got to be able to look into the data. And because what happens is most of the time, we get these big warehouses and no one ever really looks at them. But it's when you do that lift and shift, people start opening up those boxes on the top shelf and saying, oh, well, what's actually in here? It's a bit like cleaning out your loft at home. You know, you have all these boxes in there for years and years and no one ever looks at them. And then finally, when you're moving house, you've got to open up the box and say, oh, here's a bunch of, Christmas toys from when the kids were small and we don't need them anymore. We can give them to charity. And as you move you move house, you clean up a lot of the stuff that's been in boxes. And so I think it's that exercise of migrating which forces a company to say, oh, what's inside? What are we storing here? But until you do that, it just sits there because no one's got the time or desire to.
I presume it was like the whole team and the whole company doing that rather than just like an individual looking at the.
Yeah, and some individuals are conscientious and they'll clean up their little part of the big thing, but most of it is
right.
Is just
Yeah, because at my company we do have an old jQuery repository that hasn't been touched in 4 to 7 years, and I think we do need to work on that.
I've seen in these code repositories code repos that are 15, 20 years old and have not had a check-in for 15 years. And you kind of think, well, is it still in production? I don't, who knows? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the thing.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So I'm from Google. So I just want to say 2 things and 1 question.
Sure.
So the first thing is, for those of you who are not aware, Google right now is carbon neutral, and our goal is to be to run on carbon-free energy 24/7 in all our data centers by 2030. So if you want to know more about it, we have a specific
and I know
website on that.
Google is leading the way in a lot of this.
So, and the second comment is actually about our cloud, Google Cloud Summit, Sustainability Summit in June 28. So it will be great if you can join. So we will be sharing our journey and the things that we're doing on that area. Now the question is, so from your perspective and as cloud service provider, what can we do best or better in order to help on this journey?
I mean, obviously, a lot of this has to be automated. We can't, if you take the example of an IKEA warehouse, if you have 2 or 3 humans going through box by box, it will take weeks and weeks for them to clean this stuff up. So you've got to have the automated guardrails. And so we have done this with some of our clients where it's very simple stuff. Like, as I mentioned, if a Jira project doesn't get used for one year, if there's no check-ins for 1 year, whether it's a code repository or an artifact repository, etc., if it's not used for 1 year, you can send emails to the owners or have some kind of automated process saying, we will, I'm sure you get this with emails, we will delete this after 6 weeks, we will delete this after 4 weeks if we don't hear from you, etc. And then if you don't hear from anyone, you put it in deep storage or deep archive, or if you deem it not important, a lot of this stuff can be deleted. That's a bit trickier question, but certainly you can put it in some kind of deep archive. So we've got to deal with this issue through automation. And it's the people setting up all these tools in the case of DevOps tooling. It's quite easy to do a lot of that. But people don't think about it, or they're not, they're too busy delivering features and not thinking about the technical debt that they're incurring. But I think we've got to spend more time and effort and resource on the technical debt through automation to help keep these tools well maintained. Yeah. You're welcome. Any more? If not, thank you very much. Thank you.